My biggest fear is that I believe very quickly the world, and I mean the world, could lock down again. Do
It
you
could.
share that fear?
I entirely share that fear. I think that as things stand, the people who impose the lockdowns, impose the vaccine mandates, impose the mask mandates, impose the wide scale psychological panicking of the population, those people and also supported the very dangerous research that very likely caused the pandemic. Um, well, I think those people have power now. They have they give are giving themselves awards. We now have lockdown as the standard for how we deal with respiratory virus pandemics in the future, and it absolutely will happen again. It will in your lifetime of every listener
Yeah.
here. It will happen again because we have not repudiated it.
Dr. Jay Bhattacharya joins me now for this live Outspoken Members Town Hall. And Dr. Jay and I got to know each other pretty well over a little thing called the COVID pandemic. And I gained huge respect for this man who is now one of my absolute heroes. I named him as one of my top 50 freedom fighters in the world because he was prepared to put his reputation on the line. He was prepared to lose friends for doing what was right over the course of that pandemic. Dr. Jay, along with a couple of other very brilliant people, was the author of the Great Barrington Declaration, which I supported right at the start. And you'll remember that if you did support the idea of focus protection and ending lockdowns and not wanting compulsory vaccines, at that point you were derided as a granny killer, as some sort of crank. But Dr. J, despite being at Stanford University, which is, of course, a hotbed of liberalism, stood firm. He is now, I would say, one of the world's biggest brains when it comes to science and medicine. He is now a close advisor on matters to many important people in this debate, including the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis. And that is why it is such a great pleasure to have him here this evening. And look, just before we get into Jace, some of the more important policy issues. I just want to ask you a little bit personally what a toll your position over the pandemic took on you, because I imagine and there was a very human story for you. I imagine you lost friends. I imagine you were rejected by many people.
My world turned upside down, Dan. In 2020 and 2021, I mean, it was. I mean, I don't want to get too much into this, but like there were people that were close to me that essentially betrayed me, that threw me under the bus. I had death threats constantly for 2 straight years. Omicron cured that, I guess, or something. Um, and it was really a striking to me because I was when I first started in this COVID debate, I was acting like just purely a scientist. I was just doing science. It was a stunning thing to see the reaction, the negative, visceral reaction to basic science that I was doing. And then as I became more and more concerned about the lockdowns, I felt I had to speak up. At one point, I lost 30 pounds, Dan, of anxiety.
Really?
I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Like I just kept praying, and eventually, when I decided that I was going to speak no matter what the costs, the anxiety lifted in 2020. But it was, I mean, I gained some of it back,
Yeah.
thank goodness. But
I love that. There's a sort of peace that comes with the freedom of being able to say what you want. And I should say right at the start, actually, Jay and I are now Substack buddies, and I absolutely recommend that you all follow the Illusion of Consensus. I'll obviously put the link in the YouTube video and on my Substack. Now, this is an absolutely brilliant Substack that Jay runs with a very talented young man called Rav Aurora. And I know you're upping your game. You've got some incredible guests coming in your podcast, which we'll talk about later on. But I just wondered, Jay, so you talk about that personal toll. Have you had people now who have seen where the Overton window has moved to, who have come back to you and said, oh, we were wrong? or are people so entrenched in their positions?
I mean, there have been people that had done that, which has been, quite nice. I mean, these are friends of mine, people I love. It was hard to be estranged from them. But most people around here, at least at Stanford, they'll quietly come back without like pretend like nothing happened, which is actually fine. I mean, it's fine. I don't need to. I'm supposed to forgive my enemies. I'm not supposed to. I'm not going to hold a grudge. There's no purpose in that.
Yeah.
Most of them were just scared, or just for whatever reason they had they just couldn't see outside of the. I mean, it was really hard for everyone to see outside of the picture painted in front of you. Dan, that's why I was so grateful to you that you put me on your show at a time when it was risky to do so, when it was really quite a transgressive act. Other journalists have told me that like they risked their career in a way by having me on in 2020 or 2021.
Yeah, well, we started speaking early in 2020, and look, I've gone back and I've looked at the tapes over that time, because even in early March 2020, I was saying the UK must never lock down in a compulsory manner. It goes against everything that we believe in. I think it will be completely destructive. I have those tapes. I fell out with friends at the time who told me that I was absolutely selfish for believing in that. Now, then Boris Johnson, who I supported at the time, I was a big supporter of Boris. You've got to put this into a political context. We had the Brexit debate going on in the UK. I was a supporter of Brexit. So I was a big Boris supporter. And he said, look, 3 weeks to flatten the curve. And it's one of my big regrets, but I thought, okay, fine, 3 weeks. I'll go along with this for 3 weeks. But I was always skeptical. I had this incredible platform at the time because I was hosting the Drive Time show on Talk Radio, and we would get the government briefings because in the UK, they happened at 5 p.m. each night. And I gave it the 3 weeks, and then very quickly, both on Talk Radio and in my column in The Sun. And look, I will admit I was behind Peter Hitchens, who's one of the great freedom fighters of our time. But I really was one of the first mainstream journalists, probably behind Peter, the second mainstream columnist in the UK to call for the lifting of lockdown. And then I discovered you, and you would come on the show regularly. And again, I was very proud to be a signatory of the Great Barrington Declaration. Quite famously, Jay, I got into a confrontation with a guy called Chris Bryant, who's very senior in the Labour Party, and he is likely to be in the next cabinet, or at least a minister. And he called me on air a dangerous nutcase for supporting the Great Barrington Declaration and believing in the idea of herd immunity. So I absolutely put a lot on the line, but I think the slight difference is that I was backed, or at least given the freedom at the time, by my bosses, whereas if you look at academia, you weren't really. And I want to look at, I mean, you talk about death threats, but there was a lot of sinister stuff going on within the government, though, too. What wasn't there, Jay? That they wanted to silence you. Have you been able to get to the bottom of this yet? Do you know if the CIA was involved? Do you know if your emails were hacked? What have you learned?
So here's what I know in the United States. I think we've gotten pretty far. It's not the CIA. It was actually the federal scientific agencies, the CDC, the National Institute of Health, but also, like, it turns out, the FBI. Were all involved in a wide-scale effort to censor speech of Americans like me. Actually, not just Americans, people worldwide, on social media that were questioning the COVID narrative. We know this because I am a plaintiff in a lawsuit brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office against the Biden administration. In that lawsuit, we managed to get access to emails, to depose federal officials from, as I said, from the CDC, the NIH. We deposed Tony Fauci for 8 hours. And we managed to find a pattern of essentially government officials threatening social media companies, telling them who and what to censor in the United States. something that violates the American First Amendment. A federal judge, when looking at the evidence, called this essentially something akin to an Orwellian ministry of truth.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, the case is in front of the Supreme Court. We have a preliminary injunction that the Supreme Court has stayed that's told the Biden administration to stop doing this, to stop censoring Americans and at scale. But I'm telling you, I don't think, Dan, it's just Americans. I mean, in the UK, I mean,
It was insane.
There was Ofcom, right? I think, which is
the off-communists. That's what I call them, Jay. The off-communists, because they officially issued sanctions to broadcasters saying, do not question the narrative, which meant journalists who acted like sheep, by the way. I mean, you may have been embarrassed by a lot of your profession, but my goodness, Jay, it was over 2020 when I split from my profession. I don't want to be a mainstream journalist. I don't want to be a Westminster journalist because they were sheep. But yes, the bosses were effectively told, if you challenge anything official, whether it's from the World Health Organization, the UK government, you will be sanctioned.
But, you know, part of that was the scientific community within the UK, right? So there was within SAGE, the group of scientists that were advising Boris, they had a group called the Nudge Unit.
Yes.
Essentially a using psychological tools to manipulate the public, including media, telling how media what they were allowed and not allowed to say. There was, I'm sorry to say, people like Dominic Cummings, who was a close advisor, to Boris Johnson, who absolutely panicked early in the pandemic, misread the scientific data, and pushed Boris toward lockdown.
Yes, because Boris, this is the thing. I was highly critical of Boris at certain points, but I truly believe, and I'm interested in your view on this, but I truly believe, Jay, if he had tried to hold the course, because remember, he didn't want to lock down, he wanted to go for a herd immunity strategy. And initially, he was actually backed up by Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific officer. I genuinely believe if Boris had tried to do that, he would have been booted from office within 6 weeks. We have seen what happened to Liz Truss in the UK. She was Boris Johnson's successor, out within 45 days because she wasn't prepared to follow the economic orthodoxy. At that time, if Boris had stood firm and said, I'm not looking the country down, and my goodness, I wish he'd tried. Of course, I wish he'd tried. But honestly, Jay, I think he would have been removed from office by anti-democratic forces. And I do not believe that is a conspiracy. You've got to look at all of the forces that were working together to ensure that lockdown happened in all major democracies.
Can I just say one thing about where I personally assign the blame? And I blame scientists. Fundamentally, scientists gave politicians tremendously bad advice. They misled journalists. Good journalists were misled for years. And it was official science, like the very top scientific officials in the UK, people like Jeremy Farrar, who was the head of the Wellcome Trust. And you had Neil Ferguson,
yes,
who was with his model that was so clearly.
Yeah, even though he was breaking the rules himself and having this stripped over. Well, what about Vallance and Whitty? Because they became our version of Anthony Fauci. They were the blokes that became famous.
Dan, they knew the right thing to do from the beginning. You can go back to February 2020. There's this fantastic press conference with them essentially saying, look, we should protect vulnerable people. They basically wrote the Great Barrington Declaration long before we did.
Yes.
And they succumbed to pressure and groupthink in a way that scientific advisors never should have. If they had stood strong, Matt, just put yourself in that. They had stood strong and told Boris, look, this was the right thing to do, even though there's political pressure. Boris hadn't been so freaked out by his near-death experience with COVID early on. Remember, I think that also played a pretty important role. If Dominic Cummings had been given the sideline, if Rishi Sunak's I think his instinct early on was against lockdowns, actually. He pushed back even with that Eat Out to Help Out program, which he's gotten a lot of grief for. And so I think that Boris might have been able to put together a political coalition that could have withstood the pressure. But you're absolutely right, Dan. There would have been tremendous pressure.
Because you've got the whole media working with every globalist organization. The one country that held firm was Sweden. But it's a very different society, and it didn't have the international media eyes demanding that it locked down.
Yeah, in that sense, like someone like Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, where the eyes of the world were on him, and he was essentially bucking his president that was saying, lock down.
Which has obviously caused fault lines to this day. I want to talk to you about DeSantis, actually, because I don't know if it's formal or informal, but you certainly became an advisor to him, didn't you? Talk to me about how that relationship developed and if you're still working with him today.
It's always just been informal. What happens? I'll tell you how it started. Very early on, I think it's like August 2020. The Department of Education in Florida called me and asked me if I'd be willing to serve as an expert witness in this school opening case. The governor had ordered every single school district in Florida to have in-person schooling, which was a great move on the part. I mean, I live in California, and my kids didn't go to school inside of a classroom for a year and a half. Yeah, but in Florida, the teachers' unions had sued the governor for that move, saying it's unsafe to have in-person schooling, even though Sweden had opened schools. Actually, even the UK had moved toward opening schools in person to some extent in that summer. And so I served as an expert witness, pro bono expert witness. We eventually won that case, and the kids in Florida got to go to school. In September 2020, I got a call out of the blue on my cell phone. I'm not sure how he got my number, but I talked to the governor for 2 hours, and I was tremendously impressed. I was tremendously impressed by him. I mean, we talked about scientific papers. How many politicians do you know that have read the footnotes of scientific papers? And and then a week later, I did a press like a press event. It was like a 2-hour policy event with him where the press was there. And then the day after that, he lifted the remaining lockdown restrictions in Florida in September 2020. And then
so you gave him a lot of confidence to do that.
I think the thing is, I think that if politicians had seen that there was actually scientific discussion, that there wasn't a lockstep, everyone has to agree on the lockdowns. Everyone has agreed on the lockdowns, the only way, the only safe way is the lockdowns. There's a scientific consensus on them. I think a lot of politicians might have done what DeSantis did. DeSantis was special because he took the time to delve into the scientific debate that was happening underneath the surface. Whereas a lot of other politicians just accepted the scientific advice given to them by people like Tony Fauci, by people like Jeremy Farrar, and just said, look, we have to do this thing because if we don't, millions of people are going to die. I sat in the Oval Office with President Trump in August of 2020 at his invitation. And I mean, my sense was that his instincts were correct, that the lockdowns and the school closures were doing more harm than good in August of 2020. But I don't think he didn't have the same kind of command of the detail of the scientific literature that Ron DeSantis did. And he just, I mean, it's very, very difficult for politicians, I think, to be put in a position like that where they don't generally have the expertise and they're getting this advice that if you don't listen to me, you're going to kill millions of people.
So you supported the Ron DeSantis presidential bid?
So I don't make any. I'm in public health, and I really very strongly believe that people in public health should not be supporting or not. I mean, we should be giving advice regardless of who comes to us, and I'm happy to talk with everybody. But I will say I don't support censorship, and I'm really quite upset with President Biden for instituting his censorship of me and others. So I think I can say that fairly. But I don't think making an endorsement is right for people in public health.
But you were involved in some of his events, weren't you?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, he regularly would call me, and I'd be very happy to like talk with him and give him advice and be part of the public roundtables. One of them in March of 2021 got me in quite a bit of trouble, actually, because I told him publicly that it was a bad idea, that there was no good evidence that masking toddlers, in the U.S. we mask 2-year-olds, that masking toddlers, any good scientific evidence behind it. And that led to YouTube censoring me talking to the sitting governor of Florida. It led to 100 of my colleagues at Stanford circulating a secret petition asking the president of the university to silence me in 2021. But he after that policy roundtable, he issued an order saying got a law passed saying you can't mandate masks. not allowed to. You're not allowed to mandate masks, and certainly not toddlers, because there's no scientific evidence to do it. And there's some evidence of harm. So yeah, I think I don't know if I'd call myself. I'm definitely not a formal advisor. But I'm certainly an informal advisor and a great admirer of the man.
But he didn't win the nomination. He didn't even come close. So we do have the status quo, but with a twist. This election is very likely to be fought between Biden and Trump. However, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been a great questioner of the COVID orthodoxy, specifically when it comes to the vaccines, but not limited to that, is this independent candidate, no longer a Democrat, making quite a lot of waves. I've spoken to him over the course of the pandemic, like I spoke to you. He was certainly a voice that I respect and believe should have a platform. Even today, he's been censored, Dr. J. So where do you stand on RFK Jr.?
I think it is quite healthy for the American public that we have RFK Jr. in the race. He was squarely against the lockdowns and like vocally so. He was squarely in favor of being careful with the COVID vaccines and acknowledging that there were vaccine injuries. He is squarely in the camp of honest public debate over public health issues. I mean, there are elements of his platform on health that I might disagree with, but I don't see him as dogmatic. I see him as open, and I think that is incredibly healthy. And I'm very, very pleased and happy that he is in the race, because he gives Americans a real choice. With Biden, you have somebody who supported and still supports censorship in order to blunt criticism of his policies in health. In Trump, you have somebody who I think had the right instincts on COVID, but honestly, he's the father of the lockdowns in the United States. He imposed them, and
like Boris.
And he's still unrepentant to some degree. And so I do think that having RFK Jr. in the race guarantees that this presidential election will see the COVID response as part of the political discussion of 2024, which I think is healthy for the country.
Did you advise RFK Jr. at all, or have communication with him?
I have. So I actually got to interview in this room, actually, his vice presidential candidate, Nicole Shanahan, who I think is really a very interesting person. And I've talked with him a couple of times. I've also he occasionally posts on Twitter, my tweets, and he's talked about me. So I mean, I greatly admire the man, and I'm so glad that he is running.
In the UK, Jay, did any of the major politicians reach out to you? I mean, I know Sunitra Gupta, who was obviously your co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, was brought into number 10 to provide a little bit of balance, although she, alongside Carl Hennigan, were effectively ignored and piled on by everyone else. But I just wonder, people knew about you. They saw you in the media. Did any senior politicians from the UK reach out to you at all?
You're not going to believe this, but the only one was Matt Hancock.
Really?
In April.
I wouldn't have expected that.
I figured you wouldn't. It was interesting because I'd run a study in Santa Clara, California. Basically, what we did is we measured how many people had antibodies to COVID in April of 2020. And it turned out there was for every person that had been identified with COVID, there were 40 or 50 people walking around with antibodies that indicated they'd already recovered from COVID very early in the pandemic. That had enormous implications. That meant that the infection fatality rate was much lower than people were saying. It wasn't 3 or 4%. It was more like 0.2%. It meant that the disease, it's one of these things where you either get it at 0 as soon as it comes out of a lab or whatever, or it's going to go to 100. Right? There's no in between. So as the 3% of the population already had it, meant there's no lockdown that's going to stop it, and it meant that we still had a long way to go before the pandemic was over. So he called me, actually, and I had a conversation with him. And with the UK was just in the starting to do a nationwide study similar to ours. So he called me and spoke with me. I don't know. He seemed like he was out of his depth, Dan, I have to say. He did not compare to some of the
That's the understatement of the year. If only he'd listened to you, but then if only a whole load of these people had listened to you. And look, I'm getting loads of specific questions in, Jay, which I want to get to. And by the way, for those watching live, there is an opportunity, of course, for you to raise your hand, and I will get you on as soon as I can. And in fact, we're going to go now to Darren Donaldson, who is speaking to us from Scotland. So I'll just get your video on, Darren, and great to have you here. What is your question for Dr. Jay Bhattacharya?
Good evening, Doctor. Good evening, Dan. And hello to all the clubbies watching.
Great to have you, Darren.
My question today is, what country do you think performed the best, and which country do you think performed the worst in dealing with the pandemic?
Good question.
Great question, Darren. I think there's no question that Sweden performed the best. If you look at, and you don't need to go too deep, you just need to look at all-cause excess deaths. All-cause meaning deaths from any cause. Excess meaning you check how many people died in Sweden in 2015 to 2019 as a baseline expectation for how many you would expect to have died absent the pandemic. And excess means how many died relative to that expectation. Sweden has the lowest all-cause excess deaths in all of Europe, and in fact, all of the world, with maybe New Zealand as a competitor. The importance of this is that means that they protected human life without the lockdowns. In other words, you did not need lockdown to protect human life, right? That's a really important lesson. So their school children have no learning loss. They do not have the anxiety and depression rates that we're seeing. They have much less of the economic hangover. So I think Sweden, performed the best. Now, Darren, if you permit me to be parochial here, I think the United States performed the worst. Our all-cause excess deaths are terrible. Our economic damage is catastrophic. We still have lingering inflation. We decimated the working class. We decimated our children. The learning loss, anxiety, hangover is still there. It's just quite sad as a person who believed very strongly in the strength of American public health before the pandemic to have to say we did terribly poorly.
Absolutely fascinating, because I remember time and again saying, look to Sweden, look to Sweden. I promise you, Sweden is going to come out best. And again, the criticism that I got, and here you are all of these years later, Sweden was right, the Swedish strategy was right, and no one has really acknowledged that. But Darren, thank you so much for your brilliant question. We've got Maggie Payton on the line now. Maggie, where are you calling from?
Scotland.
Oh, brilliant. Which part?
The Highlands.
Oh, wow. I love it. Love it. Maggie, what's your question for Dr. Jay Bhattacharya?
Okay, I was torn between two questions, but I'll settle on this one. Doctors are now split here on long COVID. Some GPs are just sending people away saying it doesn't exist, and others are diagnosing it and sending people for help. What's your take on long COVID? And is it what we used to call post-viral fatigue?
Yeah. Maggie, I think you're right. I think that's very likely what it is. It looks very similar to me to what happens sometimes after influenza infection, for instance. Now, I don't know that for a fact. There's still a lot left to be learned about it. I do think that it is overdiagnosed, unfortunately, because there are a lot of non-specific symptoms that have nothing to do with having had COVID. And of course, if you had COVID and you were hospitalized or put in the ICU, it is going to take a long time to recover. So I don't agree with people who say it doesn't exist as a syndrome. I do think that it is overdiagnosed. I think that and that overdiagnosis does a disservice to people who actually have these sort of lingering symptoms really that are due to this post-viral condition. And I think more research is warranted. I don't think panicking the population over COVID and long COVID is warranted. There's a number of studies that have compared people who had COVID versus people who never had COVID in 2020. And the incidence of long COVID symptoms were similar in the people who had and did not have COVID. So it says this is going to be a complicated thing. There's going to be
and let's just be frank. There are millions and millions of people in the UK alone who are using long COVID to claim benefits, to not go back to work. It is a massive issue for the entire UK economy. I'm sure the same thing is happening internationally. So I do think a lot of people are hiding behind long COVID. I have my doubts. But look, Maggie, you've got another question. Go on. We've got time.
Yeah, it was about masks. And right at the very start of 2020. Now, my background's in nursing and I obviously studied biology. And the science didn't add up to me that a paper mask would prevent a virus, which is minuscule, you can't see it, from getting into you or getting out of you. And yet scientists stood up in podiums every night at 5 o'clock to tell us these masks would prevent a virus from getting to us.
They lied.
How did they get away with that?
They lied, didn't they?
Mm.
It was stunning to me to watch, Maggie. I think so. First, I think most of those paper masks, they did nothing. The randomized trials show they do nothing. The FFP2 masks, if you wear them for a couple of hours and they're not wet, might have some protection, but they don't. I mean, people were recommended to wear them continuously for hours on end, and they would reuse them, wet or dry. In healthcare settings, you wear them for a short period of time, then you take them off, you change the mask. It's regulated. To ask the general public to do it, it was clearly not going to work. And I have glasses. Whenever I wore a mask, my glasses would fog up. That's virus escaping through the top. If I was sick. So now the question is, how did it happen? I think part of the answer is that. So Maggie, you're a nurse, so you probably have seen trainee medical students or new doctors. When they talk to patients, that you can see in their eyes, they don't know what's going on, but they feel like they have to know because they're wearing a white coat and they have to say something.
Yeah,
I think that's what happened in public health at large. They were confronted with something where they didn't know the answer, and so they felt like they had to embrace absolute nonsense. I think the right, honest thing to do in that situation, if you're in public health or you're in medicine or whatever, is to say, I don't know.
Yeah, but don't we have to call these people out, though, who made these ridiculous proclamations and are still trying to tell us what to do about public health now? I'll give you an example, Dr. J. Dr. Hilary Jones, former colleague of mine. I worked with him on ITV for 10 years. Very nice man. But during the pandemic, he said that you should wear a mask if you were swimming in the sea. Yes. He said it was irresponsible to wash your car outside during lockdown. How can we trust these people again, Jay?
I mean, just to be okay, I tend to be very, what is it? Forgiving is the word, Dan. So I'll just say, I think
you're more forgiving than me. That's for sure.
I think everyone got something wrong, but I do think that people who said things like that, they owe the public an honest explanation.
Yes.
I was wrong. I'm very, even Governor DeSantis, I got to interview him in May of 2020, or no, August of 2021. And he said he was wrong to shut down the country, to shut down his state in March of 2020.
Well, look, I've immediately said today, I should never have backed that first 3-week lockdown.
It was beautiful. I don't think the thing is we don't hold people to standard of always being right about everything, especially new situations. So I'm forgiving to that. But someone who stands in front of the public and says things like that, they're so obviously not scientific. They owe the public an explanation before we really start to trust them.
Yeah, well, especially when they're doing it 2-3 years later, and you have to wonder about their personal motivation, because there are a lot of people who were profiting off this, who were becoming famous as a result of this, who were getting lots of access to powerful figures and got drunk on that sort of institutional power. And I think you're right. We can forgive them only if they acknowledge what their mistakes are, so that in the future they don't do the same thing. But Maggie, brilliant questions. Thank you so much. We have Jackie on the line now. Jackie, you got your camera on. Brilliant. Where are you calling from today, Jackie?
Manchester.
Lovely. And what is your question for Dr. J?
Hi, everyone. When the virus came to the UK, our scientists were saying that it was unprecedented, it was a novel virus. But there was one person that I was listening to, Dr. Mike Eden, that was saying there were 80% similarities with the original SARS. Is this correct? And did we know more than the scientists were telling us?
So thank you, Jackie, for that question. So this is a coronavirus, and it is a SARS-like coronavirus. So it's not surprising they would share some homology with some commonality with the original SARS virus. I do think there was a novel virus. I do think, and it was was everywhere. The particular features of it, again, in defense of the scientific community, were alarming in the early days. I think if I'm gonna just be completely open about what I think happened, I think this was a lab leak, and the result of an extremely irresponsible scientific program, where scientists would go into the wild places, bat caves of China, bring the viruses into labs to study them, this was a lab accident.
But can I just interrupt, Jay? I mean, I completely agree with the lab leak theory, but are you saying that it was accidental, that it wasn't a bioweapon?
I don't know that for fact, Dan, but I think that that's the most likely explanation. I mean, I don't have classified clearance, so I can't say with certainty. And of course, I think the Chinese have not been very forthcoming with what happened in that lab, so it's very impossible to say with certainty. But this is
because China benefited, right? When you now look at the route, you look at this at the whole, China benefited from what happened to the West.
I don't know. I mean, I just saw a story, Dan, about the economic damage to China that they're hiding still from the lockdown. The thing about bioweapons, if this is a terribly bad bioweapon, right? It infects everybody. We have no technology to stop it. We didn't, when it came out, have any vaccines or treatments for it, even for the Chinese population. It already caused this massive blow up in Wuhan, and China locked its country down for all of 2020, almost all of 2022, in a futile bid to stop it from spreading. If it was a bioweapon, it was a tremendously stupid bioweapon. It's not the kind of bioweapon you would use. So I just don't know. It looks to me like it was, because the civilian argument for the research program was that, well, you need this research program because we can use it to identify viruses in the wild before they make the leap to humans, and develop vaccines and countermeasures before that happens. The evidence that I've seen suggests that this is an extremely irresponsible thing to do, especially to bring these viruses into civilian centers, large cities, and study them there, and in places that don't have very good containment. I'm not even sure it's possible to contain this virus really well, even in a high security environment. There was a Taiwanese lab in 2021 during the pandemic that was studying this virus, and there was a leak out of that lab documented in 2021, causing a local outbreak in Taiwan. So this is,
Western scientists ignored all of these warning signs.
I think that, so this is a story that's still developing, Jackie. I wish I could fully answer your question. Yeah. I don't know the answer to them, in part because the people that do know the answers have worked very hard to hide it from the public, and the story is slowly starting to come out, and we're going to learn more over time.
There's been cover up after cover up. Completely agree with that. Jackie, thank you so much for your question. Melanie is on the line now. Melanie, where are you calling from?
Hi, I'm calling from Berkshire,
Lovely.
Windsor and Maidenhead.
Great to see you. What's your question for Dr. Jay?
Dr. Jay, with all these conspiracy theories, and there's another chap that I follow, Dr. John Campbell, who's been repeatedly shut down for calling attention to certain things.
He's a wonderful scientist.
Is there any data that we are going to be shown, especially around excess deaths? Because John Campbell was saying for certain times of the year, actually these people are dying of flu, and there's no higher incidence of people that are dying of flu around this time. They're not excessive all dying of COVID. And for a long period of time, there were lots of horror stories about doctors just putting cause of death, COVID. Are we ever going to see real data of what the COVID deaths actually were. I mean, I've had arguments with my GP who wouldn't meet me face to face for a year. But none of the dentists in the country shut down. Dentists dealing with open mouths, because they're private companies, they locked down for what, 3 months, and they were all back open. And we don't have a dentist shortage in the UK. They're all alive and kicking, so are their teams and so are their patients. So what is the real data of COVID true deaths, as opposed to just dying of old age, flu, or whatever other spikes in the natural?
Very good question. What do you think, Dr. Jay?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Melanie. Thank you. I think that the reason why I focus on all-cause excess deaths is because a death is a death. That you're going to count a death, right? So there's no controversy over the cause of it. With COVID, I'll just stick to the United States. There were financial incentives to diagnose COVID. In the early days, if you were hospitalized with COVID, the hospitals would get a $50,000 bonus for the per COVID patient. It's an enormous amount of money. Even today, a patient who dies with having had a COVID diagnosis in the last 28 days can get a $10,000 funeral benefit. If you die of cancer, you get zero. So there are still incentives to diagnose COVID, financial incentives. That said, of course, there were a lot of people who had COVID. So, but the question of how much of it was COVID, the basic facts are 80% of the deaths are people over the age of 65. And so you have a lot of people that were dying, in a way that they might have died of other causes. It's very complicated to assign a cause of death, especially when there's financial incentives involved. You're going to get some sort of distortions. And so I think ultimately, let me give you one more data point before I just sum up. In the early days of the pandemic, there were autopsy studies done of patients who died with COVID. Died with a COVID diagnosis. And the estimate in the United States, there are people like in Santa Clara County, where I live, Alameda County, and elsewhere, that concluded that 25% of the people who were diagnosed as dying from COVID actually had died from some other cause. 25%. That's in the early days of COVID. Probably now it's much higher than that. So I think the story will eventually come out, what fraction really was COVID or not. It's a complicated story, and we're never going to know the full truth of it. What we do know is that the all-cause excess deaths don't lie. And there you have continuing all-cause excess deaths in the UK, continuing all-cause deaths in the excess deaths in the US, and not in Sweden. And so that's a really important part of the story.
Well, of course. And you look at this, Dr. J, and you see how big pharma has benefited in so many ways from COVID. Do you understand why so many members of the public have lost faith now with big pharma as a result?
Dan, big pharma behaved, what's the kindest way I can put it? Incredibly irresponsibly.
You don't have to be kind.
Unethically.
We're outspoken.
My friend Asim Malhotra, he calls them psychopathic. So, I'm not sure I want to say that, but I do think that they behaved incredibly irresponsibly and unethically. They, in normal times, you would have regulatory bodies telling them you're not allowed to say that your product does, prevents you from getting and spreading COVID when you don't have evidence that it stops you from getting and spreading COVID, right? And yet you had governments putting out propaganda on the behalf of big pharma, essentially vastly overstating what the products that they were putting out could do, and they were vastly overstating the safety of the products as well. And so you have a situation where I completely understand why the public has lost trust, Dan. I've lost trust, and I think, and it's going to take. I think it's very important that we have a trustworthy public health establishment, but the public health establishment should be trustworthy in order to get the public's trust, and they have a long way to go to earn that back.
Melanie, amazing question. Look at what it prompted. Thank you so much for calling in. And we cross now to Essex, and my lovely friend Olivia, who has rushed home from work to be here. Olivia, what's your question to Dr. J?
Thanks, Dad. Dr. J, it's an absolute honour to be able to ask you a question today. I'm a radiographer. I've worked throughout the pandemic, and at my hospital, compared to other hospitals, the guidance varied. If you were outside of the hospital, the guidance varied. It was constantly changing, depending on which news station you listened to, what TV channel you watched, the guidance, the advice, it was always different. So should there be another pandemic, and one that is potentially a lot worse, say bird flu finally, goes into human transmission, worst case scenario, I appreciate, will the public ever trust experts again? And just following on very slightly from what you just said now, with regards to the medical professionals and medical journals and research, will that even be trusted? Whose opinions will people actually trust over another, seeing as though the last few years, it feels like, you only sort of go with who you, for instance, Dan's sort of way of thinking is very much my own. And are we likely to be not listening to the experts as we should because of what's happened over the last couple of years?
Such a fundamental question, Dr. Jay.
Olivia, that's a great question. And I think that question of trustworthiness is fundamental to public health. Public health, its main currency is trust. And when that's gone, it is incapable of doing the good it needs to be able to do for the public. I think, like in the hypothetical you gave, which is that there's a deadly disease, again, floating around even worse than COVID. I think that fear like we're built to look to gurus when we are scared, Olivia. And I think that will happen. But the kind of thing that will happen is that in that situation is that public health won't be the guru next time. There'll be lots and lots of people, some of whom are right and some of whom are wrong, and you'll see a lot more split in the public, and it'll be much more difficult for public health to get compliance with its edicts and orders because it's seen as having failed during this pandemic. It's a dangerous situation, actually, because I do think that honest, good advice needs to be given in the middle of an emergency. But I think the only real way to do that is for public health to acknowledge the tremendous catastrophic mistakes it made in the last pandemic, and then to devise reforms that change the way it operates. What public health did, the reason why it went so badly off was that it systematically excluded voices that disagreed with it, even reasonable voices, from the earliest days of the pandemic, right? It decided that it knew, very famously, Dr. Tony Fauci gave an interview where he was asked about, criticisms of him. And he said to the interviewer, it seemingly was no irony whatsoever. If you criticize me, you're not simply criticizing a man, you're criticizing science itself. What kind of person says or thinks or does that? I mean, that's not someone you want to trust, right? That kind of hubris. There has to be some humility inside public health so that it's able to withstand outside criticism, even during an emergency.
Has Fauci ever tried to reach out to you?
No, he is not.
No.
Yeah, I think he, at this point, I view him as a failed leader. Which is sad because I did admire him at the start of the pandemic. I think, but that Olivia, I share your point of view and I appreciate your question. I don't know the answer to that. I think part of the answer has to be an honest COVID commission. I've been watching what's happening in the UK with the COVID inquiry, and it seems like they haven't yet grappled with what happened.
No.
Like they want to say, oh, Boris was bad because he didn't lock down.
Yeah.
It's just nonsense. I mean,
exactly. Oh, if we'd locked down 10 days earlier, none of this would have happened. How can you genuinely still think that? This shows me that some of these people are either willfully blind or completely stupid. But Olivia, it must have been so difficult for you working in the health system or over all of this, given your very sound views. But thank you so much for calling in. And Dr. Jay, we're getting loads of questions coming in via text. So I'll go through these now and we can try and answer them quite quick fire because we've got lots of them. But on a similar point, Alison writes, what about the doctors who refused to take the vaccine? Did they know something we didn't?
They knew that the randomized trials had not shown that the vaccine stops you from getting and spreading COVID. They didn't even look at that in the randomized trials. At least I hope they knew that. They knew that any new product can sometimes have side effects. And they probably were thinking that for people that were low risk, younger people especially, there was no real prospect of huge benefit. So what's the reason? I personally, I should say, Dan, was a proponent of older people taking the vaccine. The risk of dying from COVID was so bad for older people. I was against taking the vaccine for younger people. In fact, I wrote something in April of 2021 saying young people shouldn't take the vaccine, which got me a fair bit of trouble. I think like reasonable doctors were looking at it and saying, what's the evidence of benefit? What's the evidence of harm? And making appropriate choices for them.
A very important question from Liam Watmarth, who asks, do you think the proposed World Health Organization treaty could hand too much power to shady international governmental organizations and take away countries' sovereignty and ability to make key decisions in the event of a future pandemic? And I'm very concerned about this treaty. Dr. Jay, where do you stand on it?
I agree with you, Dan, entirely. I'm very concerned about this treaty. I think just broadly, the World Health Organization failed. It absolutely failed during the pandemic. And it's responded to that failure by empowering people who contributed to that failure. The chief scientific officer of the World Health Organization is a man named Jeremy Farrar, who is the head of the Wellcome Trust, who was a key architect of the UK's COVID policy and a big proponent of the research that likely led to the lab leak. He was involved in the cover of it, and of the lockdowns and the suppression of scientific debate in 2020. So I think the World Health Organization does not deserve more power. The treaty. I've talked to two people in members of parliament in Africa, in various African countries, scholars there. They view it as a neo-colonial imposition, essentially a grabbing of power by the West of the public health policy of poor countries. And of course, even for the West, it's an imposition of power. Essentially, look what happened during the pandemic. Essentially, we had as our overlords scientific mandarins for years. They were setting policy for the US and the UK and Germany and for country after country. Do we really want, that's what the WHO, that's what it represents, that's what that treaty represents, is paneling an anti-democratic regime on top of our democratic infrastructure to say at any time, look, we shouldn't be a democracy, we should just listen to
and we don't want it now because we've seen how they operate when they're tested and it leans towards authoritarianism, and no, we don't want that. James Bembridge asks, lockdown measures were enforced not just by the state, but by its citizens. Do humans secretly like the idea of being enslaved to authority? And if so, why?
Well, I think, Dan, human psychology has at its root our lizard brain, which responds to fear in ways that betray our higher ideals. When we are scared for our lives, we do things that we would never otherwise do. And I think that we saw some of the worst of human behavior during the pandemic because of that panic and fear. And absolutely, people were telling on each other. There was a snitch line in my county where you would call in and say, "Oh, my next door neighbor is having a party."
Yes.
It's insane, right, to think about. But I think, again, I put the blame on public health and on scientists. Public health, which it's as ethical ideals say, don't panic the public, give the public honest information, try to keep people calm so that we can behave rationally. Instead, stoked panic and fear from the earliest days of the pandemic. That panic and fear, especially the fear of infectious disease, is deeply rooted in the human psyche. And what it leads to is treating other people like biohazards. That is so, and in fact, that's the fundamental ideology of the lockdown, was to treat your fellow human as a biohazard. And public health embrace that idea, spread that idea, and cause the inhumane behavior that people did to one another.
And by the way, don't feel bad if you were scared, because there were billions and billions of pounds and highly elaborate psyops for you to say scared. So, there's a reason behind that. Wolf asks, given how damaging lockdowns have been for the public, both in mental and physical health, does Dr. J feel there should be some form of charges brought against those that implemented them? Now, this is becoming increasingly popular, Dr. J, the idea that there could be criminal trials in regards to the way that some people acted over the COVID pandemic and with vaccines too. Where do you stand on that one?
As I said, Dan, I tend to be somewhat forgiving, although I have to say, like my friends think I'm too forgiving on these kinds of things. I don't have much legal background, and I think so. I do think that if there was actual fraud that violated laws, that if there was violations of basic civil rights, there needs to be some kind of reckoning. Whether that reckoning involves jail time, I tend to think that that's not the key thing. I think to me the most important thing is first of all fundamental reforms of our system so that things like this never happen again. And that to me means checks and balances. I'm much more scared for the future than I am about wanting to get retribution over the past. But I'm not.
I guess for me, I worry if there's not retribution over the past, this just happens again. And the next time people are whipped up into a frenzy over whatever the new virus is, the same thing happens. And people end up vaccine injured because proper tests weren't done. I mean, should the AstraZeneca vaccine have ever been injected into anyone? I think there are serious question marks over that now.
You know, I think the key thing there is either our laws as they exist are useful to hold people like that accountable, to people who committed fraud or whatnot, and then in which case that legal process should just happen and people should have their due process rights and we should have it go forward. I mean, I think that should be true no matter what. Or our laws do not allow that to happen, right, as they currently stand. And Dan, I think if it's not an unreasonable position to that we want to reform. If we don't have laws that permit that kind of holding people accountable, and we want them through the democratic process, we should implement them. So that next time we won't have the.
I guess I just feel the very visceral feelings that the vaccine injured have, that people who lost relatives or businesses or their entire life savings to lockdowns have, especially when we see politicians across the globe just ignore this. I mean, you will have seen the scenes in the UK Parliament, for example, when vaccine harms are being discussed. And the chamber, Dr. J, just empties out. You've basically got the MP, Andrew Bridgen, a couple of others, Christopher Chope, he's another good one, a Conservative MP. But the vast majority of the MPs just do not even believe that this is an issue.
I mean, I agree with you that a very large fraction of our political establishment wants to pretend like nothing went wrong. And I also share your visceral I don't know what the right word is, like visceral desire for some kind of recompense for the vaccine injured, the lockdown injured. The harms that were done were tremendous, catastrophic, with worse harms done to children and the poor, the working class.
Because I just worry, Jay, that there's nothing that will stop this from happening again as it stands.
I mean, I agree with that. I think that what I had hoped would happen this year and starting in 2023 was that these COVID inquiries would lead to, just like when an airplane crashes, you say, okay, here's what caused the airplane crash, and you reform those systems so that airplane crashes like that will not happen again in the future. I was hoping that the inquiries would lead to that kind of spirit. Instead, what we've seen, Dan, is a spirit of let's pretend like we did everything right, except for Boris not clocking down 10 days earlier.
Yeah, well, exactly. And my biggest fear is that I believe very quickly the world, and I mean the world, could lock down again. Do you share that fear?
I entirely share that fear. I think that as things stand, the people who impose the lockdowns, impose the vaccine mandates, impose the mask mandates, impose the wide-scale psychological panicking of the population, those people and also supported the very dangerous research that very likely caused the pandemic. Well, I think those people have power now. Are giving themselves awards. We now have lockdown as the standard for how we deal with respiratory virus pandemics in the future, and it absolutely will happen again. It will in your lifetime of every listener here. It will happen again because we have not repudiated it.
Well, of course. And the whole reason that the Great Barrington Declaration was so important to come full circle is that it wasn't about waiting for a vaccine. There was a human way using established science in order to open up the world, protect the most vulnerable, because we can't do this whole rush for a vaccine thing again because people aren't going to risk it again.
I agree with you. Like, premising our civil liberties on the availability of a vaccine is a disastrous idea.
Yeah, well, it's asking for trouble, isn't it? Look at what happened.
And I think, like, let's just be honest with the public. We don't have a technology that will produce a safe and effective vaccine within a year. That's just not. It doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist. It's a lie if anyone tells you it exists. And I don't think people are going to be prepared to put themselves at that sort of risk in the future. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, you are absolutely incredible. The Illusion of Consensus is a must-read Substack. But tell me, you've got this incredible podcast relaunch coming, and I've heard about some of your guests that you've got lined up, but give us a bit of a sneak peek.
Sure. So so the Illusion of Consensus is a podcast I run with this journalist, Rav Aurora, a young man who's just an amazing.
He's brilliant.
Yeah. But we've kind of done it in an amateur. We're not like you, Dan. We're not professional broadcasters. So. You're
doing very well, I have to say, Jay.
Well, you can see I have a very fancy new microphone. We have a new fancy webcam. There's better lighting, but we're really gonna have like a professional relaunch with, like, little music and all that. The guests we have are incredible. So we're gonna speak with Russell Brand, a man named Pierre Corey, who's fantastic. On the show in the past, we've had like a vice presidential candidate running for the president, running with RFK Jr., Nicole Shanahan. We've had several guests who were key players in the lab leak debate and the vaccine injury debate. We're going to do more than just COVID. We're focused on illusion of consensus within science and public health more generally. The idea is to expand the range of conversation about a whole host of topics that people care about: depression treatment, recovery after injuries, but of course also the COVID response. So I think it's very exciting for me to be able to participate and speak with the public more generally after spending a career just quietly writing scientific papers. Yeah. Which I still kind of wanted one Sunday to get back to, Dan. But
I think this is so important because we have to be ready. I mean, as you say, there are huge other big pharma medical issues going on. I mean, we haven't even touched on it today, but you're completely right to point out the over-reliance on antidepressants, which is becoming an absolute scourge in society. But we have to be ready because we need alternative voices like yours and media platforms like mine so that when the next pandemic comes around, we can fight back from the start, because trust in the mainstream media, Jay, has been smashed as a result of COVID. But I don't view that as a bad thing. I view that as a great thing because we now have an opportunity to completely reinvent how we communicate with people so that we're not reliant on the complete hysteric and propaganda merchants at CNN in your country and at the BBC in our country. And I think we have to take the positives from that. And actually, if it hadn't been for COVID, we wouldn't have voices like yours out there doing it. So I'm a huge supporter of what you do. We will stay in touch, of course, as the weeks and months develop. But thank you so much for being part of our Outspoken Town Hall tonight.
Dan, you're amazing. I'm really grateful to you for the opportunity to talk with your audience and for I've been really glad to get to know you and people like you who put your reputations on the line so that people could know the truth. Thank you.
Exactly. New friends have been made, which is a positive too. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. from the Illusion of Consensus. Thank you so much.
Thank you.